This session is called Embedding Inclusive Teaching Practices into Quality Course Design. And we're using automatic Zoom captions during this live event. We're going to edit the recording transcripts before we share them out so that they'll be more accurate. And if you want to enable them, at the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a closed caption button. So you can turn on that feature if you'd like. If you have questions, you can feel free to pose them in the chat. And hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A towards the end. And then I will also include a link to our Padlet, which is a place where we can continue the discussion around topics that Jeff might bring up. So now I'd like to hand the microphone over to our presenter, Jeff Suarez-Grant from Cal State LA. Take it away, Jeff.
Thanks, Chelsea. I really appreciate it. Well, I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to work and meet other colleagues who are interested in this important work. Today, we're going to look at how to embed inclusive teaching practices into quality course design by way of quality assurance rubrics. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and make sure we all are kind of on the same page as to what we mean by quality assurance rubrics. Just a quick kind of overview of where we're going to go today, next 45 minutes. I want to give you kind of a sense of my context, how I got to being involved with this type of work, what's out there now in terms of like equity rubrics. There are some amazing examples that were actually shared today. And then we're going to look specifically at how annotations can be used to guide inclusive practice when faculty are creating hybrid or online courses. We'll look at how we can align those inclusive teaching practices with existing quality assurance best practices. And then we'll write an annotation together. And I think we're actually a small enough group there that's actually going to work really, really well. So let me give you some context for how I came to this work. I was the lead designer on this project at Cal State LA. I'm an instructional designer and I work in the Faculty Development Center. And typically instructional designers help faculty build online courses, but I was actually involved in building faculty development for faculty, right? Helping to build quality learning experiences for faculty. And this is one of the big projects that I worked on, our inclusive teaching program. And I have to give major kudos to the amazing team that I worked with, 5 faculty subject matter experts, my amazing design colleagues, and our amazing facilitators who've been running this program since fall 2019. It's been very well received at Cal State LA. And let me give you just kind of a sense of the program. It's 14 weeks long. It's 7 modules that each kind of focus on a different diversity, equity, inclusion topic. Everything from students with disabilities to veterans, first-generation students. And it also looks at how faculty play a role in this, including implicit bias and faculty self-care, how to kind of take care of yourself as you work through sometimes challenging situations that you'll find yourself in. It's fully online program. I'm giving you this context because at the heart of this program are 54 specific teaching practices, 54 specific inclusive teaching practices that we share with the faculty through that 14-week program. And as an instructional designer, I'm very familiar with Quality Matters, QULT, which is the Quality Learning and Teaching rubric from the CSU, California State University system. Other tools as well, like the OLC scorecard. And as I continued to work in this project, I realized that these inclusive teaching practices, the way that they were framed and written, sounded a lot like the quality assurance best practices that QM and QULT and OLC scorecard ask faculty to use. And this got me thinking, how are they similar? How are they different? And how well are these quality assurance rubrics actually helping with diversity, equity, and inclusion practice in online and hybrid courses? These are the 2 that I'm most familiar with, being an instructional designer in the Cal State system. We have our locally developed, system developed rubric, QULT, Quality Learning and Teaching. And at my specific campus, we use Quality Matters. And that is a collection of best practices for designing hybrid and online courses. And I think this is kind of like, this has been my first question to you all in terms of, do you use a quality assurance rubric at your campus? Let me know in the chat. Let me know if you do and maybe which one it is. Sounds good. Seeing some QM folks here. Maria Fernandez, my wonderful colleague, uses Colt. I'm assuming that's Maria Fernandez. I bet you it is. Yeah, so QM, pretty well known, nationally recognized organization for high quality standards in online hybrid course design, and also quickly becoming kind of an internationally recognized standard setting body for hybrid and online course design, which is kind of really important to kind of keep in mind as we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. My next question for you is really this, does Quality Matters, since we have quite a few folks who are using that, but others too, does QM really look at diversity, equity, and inclusion? How would you rate how well it looks at those important issues of inclusion in online hybrid course design? You can let me know in the chat. Yeah, and I am so amazed and happy that there are folks who are making new rubrics, right, to address this. And there's, again, 3 other amazing campuses too that are doing great work in this space. So yeah, it really doesn't. They touch on accessibility, which is an important inclusive practice. But in terms of socioeconomic status, first generation status, doesn't really touch on that. Racial, ethnic diversity, it doesn't really address any of that in online or quality course design. Late last year, during the pandemic, Quality Matters did issue some guidance on this to help with culturally relevant instruction. And they did this by way of these documents that they call course guides. And they use this to offer some additional guidance on diversity, equity, inclusion issues. And I'll share them with you here on screen in case you're not familiar with them. But basically 3 specific standards were called out for kind of being used as the vehicle for diversity, equity, inclusion practice. And that included diverse voice and representation. I'm almost not even sure we should count this one because it was already, QM already did a good amount with accessibility already, but again, a specific call out to accessibility. And then of course, interacting with students as well. This all kind of was issued in November 2020, so late last year. And it's a good start, but my assessment of this is that it's exceedingly modest. There is so much more to diversity, equity, inclusion through course design, and this is really not enough. And so this is what got me thinking about how we can enhance existing quality assurance rubrics. I am very appreciative of colleagues who are creating new rubrics, and I'll give you some context for why I went the route of enhancing existing quality assurance processes. I also want to just quickly touch on this too, these perspectives, and I'm curious to hear the group's thoughts on these 2 viewpoints, that good design is naturally inclusive, or that effective teaching helps everyone. So we maybe don't need to be too specific about it. We don't need to get into the weeds. I'm curious what folks think about this sentiment. Let me know in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself too, that's great as well. Thanks, Elisa, for that point about intentionality, right? I think that goes to the message of being specific. If you're going to be effective, you need to specifically name who you're trying to help, be specific about what you're trying to do. And so, yes, good design could be naturally inclusive, but it helps for continuous improvement and also to track your progress to be specific, to be very specific. And in fact, the folks who, UDL practitioners, Universal Design for Learning practitioners, have started to go in this direction, as well as other colleagues here at this conference today. This book from Fitzgerald, I think, is a great takes us in a great direction, where we're making connections, we're being specific about universal design for learning and how that helps further anti-racism work, making those strong connections. And not just assuming that, yes, universal design will help everybody. Again, being specific, being intentional. So again, a few more questions for you all. This is some of the questions that were kind of rattling around in my head as I worked with my faculty in the inclusive teaching program, continued to support other faculty as they developed online and hybrid courses. Is there a need for a specific rubric, a new rubric that looks just at diversity, equity, and inclusion? Can we create supplemental standards for diversity and inclusion? And how do we build on what's already there? Let me know. What do you think? Maybe you've already created a new rubric and you're in the camp of, well, we needed something totally new and different. Feel free to let me know in the chat. Janelle, I kind of hear you there, right? Like supplemental standards. Yeah, and I really appreciate that sentiment too, Maritza, that it deserves its own entirely own space, right? And it should kind of lead the way. Yes. So here's kind of my approach, and again, just some airtime to the new rubrics that are out there. Of course, have to feature Peralta. Early on in my search to try and find what was out there already, Peralta was the first rubric that I came across. Someone also sent me this rubric from University of Wisconsin Green Bay, which is kind of functions as a QM replacement. It has a rating system. And of course, there are also great examples today from University of Arizona, Arizona State, and Stanford. Our colleagues there sharing new rubrics, but also specific inclusive teaching practices as well. But here's the thing from my campus context. I have invested, my campus has invested a lot of time in Quality Matters. I personally have invested a lot of time in it as well. And so to spin up, to not only perhaps create a new rubric or to train faculty to use a new rubric is it's daunting to me personally. It is hard enough already for me to convince faculty to use Quality Matters. In fact, we try to use it more subtly. We try to use quality course design standards. We kind of sneak it in. We only kind of at the end tell them, oh, by the way, you've been doing Quality Matters, right? These are the standards that you've been using. We have trained faculty. We've gone to conferences. I'm a peer reviewer, right? There's a tremendous amount of investment there. So my perspective is, how can we enhance the QM rubric so that it still serves the needs of our students, serves the needs of our diverse students, but allows us to continue to use the existing infrastructure that we've invested a lot of time in? I think the answer to that lies in the annotations. And here's what I'm kind of proposing in some of the work that I've been doing in this area. This is, again, Cal State LA uses Quality Matters, so that's the example that we're going to use here today. Here's QM General Standard 1, that talks about the overview and introduction, communication expectations for online learners, right? What we call netiquette. And the QM annotation gives guidance for why this is important and different kind of context for why it would be important to tell students how they're supposed to interact with you and their classmates. What I'm somewhat proposing here is to add an additional column essentially and give guidance on how you can achieve a diversity and inclusion kind of goal by way of this particular Quality Matters standard. And so I think a valuable exercise to do before this is to go ahead and align your inclusive teaching practices with your quality assurance standards. And that's what I propose we do now. I'm thinking you might have your own inclusive teaching practices already at your campus that you've identified. You've maybe worked with faculty subject matter experts, a working group. And so that's like one side of your institution. And then you have maybe your global campus or your distance learning folks over here who are very well versed in quality assurance standards. So how do you get those two standards? How do you get those two things to align with one another? So let's give it a try. I'm going to put this link in the chat here. There's not too many of us, but I made a bunch of copies of this slide. And so if you're feeling like the slide is a little too crowded, you can go to one of the other slides. I think I'm going to pull this up over here so we can see it. Here we go. And what you can do is, here are general standards across the top. And what you can do is, look at each of these inclusive teaching practices and start to think about where they would fall into the Quality Matters framework. Feel free, move things around. If you want to tell us in the chat why you move something in a particular column, please feel free to let us know in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. Again, this is a sampling of our inclusive teaching practices from our program. I see some movement on slide 2 here. Let's check that out. And I think this is an important first step because it's all about aligning these two different thought processes. Let's check out slide 4 here. There's definitely some naturally kind of aligned items, right? So anything regarding media, right, depicting people of various backgrounds, that seems pretty clear, like it would go in the instructional materials column. So this is a good first step, but then of course, we're still missing our annotations because showing how these things connect is not enough. We have to give faculty guidance on how to operationalize these practices while they're also using the quality assurance practice to design that high quality learning experience. So let me move this out of the way here just for a quick second. I gave you just another minute too here to kind of finalize your selections here, your alignments. Anybody feeling like there's an inclusive practice there where you can't find a home for it in the Quality Matters framework? You can let me know in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself too. It's fascinating to see this too across different slides where how many people we have in here? About 20 folks, where people are making, where they're deciding to kind of sort things. And I think this is why it's so important to do this as an activity with your campus. Again, to get the folks in distance learning in your global campus to talk and work with folks, your diversity, equity, inclusion practitioners elsewhere in the university or the college. Sometimes those folks are in the diversity, equity, inclusion office. Like at my campus, we have a provost, vice provost for diversity, equity, inclusion, and also who works closely with our faculty development center. Again, getting those folks to talk to one another. So let's take this a little bit further. Let's look next at the annotations. and using that as, again, a vehicle for offering additional guidance for this. And I just want to address Bob's comment too about some of the actions seem to apply to many of the columns. I think that's why the annotation route is so useful, because you can refer to that diversity, equity, inclusion practice adjacent to several quality assurance practices. It's not a perfect one-to-one matchup, and that's the only kind of articulation there is between, again, inclusion and quality course design. It offers you an alternative way to, again, offer guidance. So let's look at one in particular. This one has to do with, this was the first example I gave. This has to do with a community agreement. The idea that oftentimes we give students kind of the netiquette expectations, the code of conduct. That, though, is sometimes problematic because it doesn't seek students' input, right? They are kind of just asked to abide by a set of rules that they were not involved in creating. So a diversity, equity, and inclusion annotation for this could be, there we go, allow students to define. That's the pairing, right? That's the inclusive teaching practice paired with the, what I believe to be the most closely aligned Quality Matters standard. And then here's how we could give extra guidance. We could let the faculty know how they could build in time to create a community agreement, to solicit feedback and input from all students in the class to create a document. Basically, they're the ones who are creating the netiquette. And of course, with faculty's input at the beginning. Usually when I'm explaining this, I'll mention, you can include a couple of terms that are like not negotiable, and then allow them to finish fleshing out the rest of it. Let's look at a few more here. I think this gets at Bob's point too. This is another one where, again, pronouns, preferred name, super important. There are several standards where you could operationalize this practice of inclusion. I think it aligns very nicely with the self-introduction by the instructor. For instance, like in my profile here, I'm modeling my pronouns. Again, that's important. It's important for me to do that, to set an example. When I do my instructor introduction in my course, I would probably want to do the same thing. Let my students know what my pronouns are. And then what would be the avenue for students to do that, right? So they can learn each other's pronouns. Well, QM asks, one of the standards there is, learners are asked to introduce themselves to the class, right? That's so they can get to know each other, but also so that, frankly, you can get to know them. That's, I think, really the hidden meaning or point of having students introduce themselves to each other. So I'm curious if anyone wants to take a shot here at writing an annotation for this. If you'd like to put it into the chat, I have my little work already that I'll show you here in just a quick second, but I'm curious, how would you approach writing an annotation for this? For either 1.8, which is the self-introduction by the instructor, or 1.9, which is the meet and greet form at the beginning of the semester. And if you don't feel like writing a whole annotation, let us know in the chat some important points that you'd want to feature in that annotation. Anybody use wait time in the class, in their classroom? I feel like wait time in Zoom is even more painful. Again, I'm sure you're busily writing. Again, let me know either, let me know about maybe some points to include in the annotation, or if you want to take a shot at writing the annotation for either 1.9 or 1.8. Thanks, Rondi. Right, including pronouns, Yeah, part of the instructor learner intro. Oh, yes, that's a good one. So I think where some of our diversity, I'll just use inclusive, right? Some of our inclusive practices fall apart is when we don't carry it through. We don't maintain our inclusive practice. And Janelle's point about, well, you asked them what their pronouns are, but then you don't use them later, or you refer to them as their name on the roster as opposed to their preferred name. So again, this is a great place where, this is not enough guidance, right? This inclusive teaching practice on its own is not enough guidance. We need to let them know how to carry that practice all the way through the life of that course, that semester, that quarter that they're with their students. And so that would be a great point, and to let them know that through the facilitation of the course, you have to carry the inclusive practice all the way through. I see some more here. So Sally, the inclusive practices that I'm referring to here are from our inclusive teaching program. It's a 14-week program that the Center for Effective Teaching and Learning at Cal State Allied developed for our faculty. And at the core of that program are 54 specific inclusive teaching practices. And we're looking at a small sampling of those here. Yeah, I think this is another interesting, Randy brings up an interesting point about sometimes students need a little assistance knowing how to navigate the red tape, for lack of a better word, on a campus, right? The form they have to fill out to change their preferred name. So that's even something that could go into that annotation, offer help and guidance to students who are interested in changing their name in the learning management system or the student information system. Again, lots of good guidance there. All right, let's look at a few more here. I like everyone's points here. This is great stuff. How about this one? This has to do with helping our first generation learners who sometimes have trouble navigating an institution, a space that was not designed for them. How can we address inclusion by way of learning objectives? I've made a suggestion here. This is one of the inclusive practices, using simple student-friendly language in my syllabus and my assignments. What would the annotation for this look like? I'll share the annotation I wrote for this one in the chat. I feel like this annotation also needs a little bit of unpacking. I don't want to accidentally use hidden curriculum when I'm talking about hidden curriculum. I would want to unpack the term hidden curriculum for my faculty. Again, this idea of making sure to explain terms, concepts that are unique to higher ed, and also using just friendly or conversational language. I don't know about you, but it's a little odd to read student learning outcomes that say students will. No, just say we will, right? We are going to learn to do this, right? We are going to use a yield curve to determine something. Welcoming language, yep, absolutely. Thanks, Chelsea. All right, here we go. This is our last one that we'll practice with. This is, again, another example of where a single Quality Matters standard actually has several inclusive teaching practices that align with it. These are actually two distinct inclusive practices for us. We like to make a distinction between media representation, right? Who basically is represented in the media that we use in classes, but also examples, right? So maybe perhaps in a word problem, a case study, a scenario, no media involved, it's a written description, that there needs to be a diverse representation of all people. And so most likely, I have a feeling that this, again, it kind of nicely fits with instructional materials. And Quality Matters kind of perspective on this is looking at recency, right? How recent is the work? How up to date is it? But again, this can be expanded to include representation as well. You could also make a case too for using examples and scenarios. Like this might be something that we look at in activities and assignments, which would be a different standard. And again, by way of that annotation, we can offer lots of guidance to our faculty. And again, let me know if you have any specific points, specific annotation that you're looking for, that you'd want to see in this annotation. I'll paste mine here in just a quick second too, in case you're curious. Here's the one that we wrote for this particular one. So I'm curious to hear thoughts, reactions to this particular approach to addressing diversity, equity, inclusion, and quality online course design. Yeah, I think it should include readings as well. Yeah. So not just media, scenarios that are featured in assignment instructions, case studies, absolutely readings. So yeah, thoughts, opinions on this? What do y'all think about this particular direction of addressing diversity, equity, inclusion in hybrid online course design? Invite you to use the chat. If you'd like to unmute yourself too, I welcome that. Ooh, I like that point, Sally, right? Just course content. And that covers a wide breadth of different things, including the course banner across the top of the homepage of the course, right? That wouldn't necessarily be considered like an instructional material. It's kind of like almost like collateral, like the overall design of the course. Yeah, so course content. I think in the annotation, you could get at all the different areas of the course. So readings, films, media, course collateral, right? The banner across the homepage. You could be that specific. And again, that's the beauty of the annotation. You can offer a lot of guidance there instead of trying to cram it all into a short statement on how to implement that particular practice. So I just want to be transparent here. You know, this is not a finished thing. We're still working on this. And what I'm really kind of curious and interested in is collaborators essentially to help kind of finish this off. And this is kind of just to kind of close out the session, and I can show you a little bit more of the inclusive teaching program or some more of the work that I've done to kind of create the articulation between our inclusive practices and QM. But again, I believe in this approach. It's an alternative to a new rubric. I think these two approaches are actually really important. If you're at a campus where Quality Matters or COLT or another quality assurance rubric has taken root, it's part of the culture, it's part of the infrastructure, I think this is a viable way to get faculty to implement diversity, equity, inclusion practice. An alternative to not have to support an entirely new rubric. But if you're someplace that does not have a culture of quality assurance and online and hybrid, then it might actually be better to start with one of these other rubrics. Like folks were saying in the chat earlier, so that it is at the forefront of our work and not an afterthought. Again, it kind of just depends on your campus context. And the last thing I'll say on this too is there are ways to kind of pressure Quality Matters to improve their rubric. And I think the way creating the annotations, right, creating these supplementary annotations is a great way to do that. I don't know whether or not they would, well, I don't know for sure, but the new, perhaps in a future edition of the QM rubric, they might add additional standards. But I think it's more approachable for them to enhance the existing rubric by way of the annotations, instead of having to change the number of standards that they ask faculty to look at, change the number of standards that faculty peer reviewers are looking for in a course review. The annotations could be a more viable option for that. And Roddy, you're absolutely right. You know, between the 5th and 6th, they changed a lot of the accessibility standards. And that was from advocacy from accessibility, disability advocates. I remember attending a particularly contentious conference presentation on that, where people really got into it. And that was part of what spurred them to change and update the rubric. They do listen to the community. And I think if they can basically take the annotations that campuses have created for their faculty and kind of slide that into the new rubric version, that could work really well. Yeah, I hope so. I hope there's more attention paid to diversity, equity, inclusion in the next rubric update. It's been a little while since the 6th edition, so we're perhaps ripe for some new changes there. I think I'm going to stop talking and take questions. Yeah. Janelle, I kind of agree with that. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say there were some questions that came up in the chat. Yes. And yeah, Janelle had a question about including mobile accessibility, whether or not your D&I annotation for standards related to that.
That's a good question. I'm not really an expert in accessibility, so I would probably leave that to QM and again, pressuring them to do more with Standard 8, which deals with accessibility to include different devices. Just anecdotally, I know many of the students at Cal State LA, they do their entire course on their smartphone using the Canvas app. And so it's incredibly important that that be accessible, the course be accessible to those students.
And not just the course, but also any tools that you're using should be accessible or should be mobile friendly as well.
That's incredibly important, right? Because we're reliant on third parties to build external tools that, again, Canvas is perhaps accessible on the mobile phone, but those third-party tools might not be.
And you had mentioned something that you had 54 strategies, right? Are those accessible anywhere for us to view?
They're not currently. We're in early stages of perhaps offering the inclusive teaching program to other folks outside of Cal State LA. Right now, kind of just very tentative plan is to maybe offer it to other Cal States and then perhaps to a wider audience. So not really in a position at this point to kind of release them. It's something we're interested in doing though, because we want to, other campuses that have a inclusive teaching program have gone kind of like the massive open online course route. And we're we're not really that big of a campus, so that's a kind of a daunting prospect. So again, right now we're kind of keeping it a little bit local, but we are interested in opening up to a wider audience in the future.
Thank you.
I had one other question. Did you have any issues with buy-in with, I don't know if you have course designers that, like the course designers at my institution would be the ones that would be implementing these standards when they're building out their courses. Did you have any issues with buy-in when you were creating these new standards or annotations?
So last year I did present some of this concept of doing the alignment to the Cal State Systems Instructional Design Common Interest Group. And there seemed to be the same sentiment that QM COLT is not adequately addressing diversity, equity, inclusion. And so I took that to mean that there would be openness and willingness to improve or use an alternative annotation or supplementary annotation, I should say. I know that group, they're putting together a working group to look at COLTs, which is the Quality Learning and Teaching Rubric, to better address diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I think in terms of instructional designers, course developers, at least within the Cal State system, there seems like there's interest and openness to doing that.
Jeff, there was a question from Emma. How does adherence to the DEI annotations impact overall approval of a course?
That's an interesting question, and it brings up a problematic thing that happens on my campus where I have either early career tenure track faculty or lecturers who take advantage of our training and development, our faculty development, implements inclusive practice or just implement just effective teaching in general, and then get poor course evaluations from senior faculty in the department. And so I think that goes to your point, Emma, about approval of the course, either through through the curricular review process. The dimension of diversity and inclusion needs to be included in the curricular review process, and all levels of the curricular review process, the stakeholders there need to value diversity, equity, inclusion. I think that is kind of outside my scope. That's something where the chief diversity officer, the vice provost for diversity, equity, and inclusion will come in. And there are initiatives underway at our campus to address that, including training and embedding equity advisors in departments and colleges who can help mediate those conversations. But in terms of our course and our work here, we're happy if faculty are able to make the connection between QM and inclusion and build some of that into their course.
Great. Are there any other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, then we can wrap up this session. Thank you so much, Jeff, for your enlightening presentation.
Thanks, Chelsea.
And yes, and thank you to all who are here. We appreciate you attending the session. We hope you'll be back tomorrow and on Friday. And if you were unable to make other sessions, we will be following up. Check your emails post-conference from equity@peralta.edu. We'll be giving you info for how to access the recordings. So thank you again, everybody.